Three Wives is a 1949 film directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. The titular three wives are played by Jeanne Crain, Linda Darnell, and Ann Sothern, and their husbands are played by Jeffrey Lynn, Paul Douglas, and Kirk Douglas, respectively. The film tells the somewhat scandalous story of a letter that is sent to, unsurprisingly, three women. The letter is from an infamous local woman who, in it, claims to have run off with one of their husbands. The thing is, she doesn't tell them which one she's targeted, and so begins a series of reflections in which each wife realizes it could be her marriage that's in trouble. This movie is one that I went into with very little prior knowledge, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find how much I enjoyed it. The plot synopsis is somewhat eyebrow-raising for a 1940s film, but because it was made in that era of censorship and an emphasis on happier endings for the most part, it didn't come as a surprise to me that the story isn't as seedy as a more modern take might be tempted to be. Instead, the film is a very interesting study of marriages and examination of the public faces that people can put on, and even love. What I enjoyed so much are the very different problems that each marriage faces. The film takes place largely in flashbacks, with bookending segments set in the present, and brief interstitial pieces to transition from one wife's story to the next. And these flashbacks are excellent, which brings to mind some other things that stood out to me. The pacing and the tone. With a story like this, getting bogged down in flashes to the past could get tedious, and depending on what we're depicting, could very easily tip over into soap opera territory. But no, the amount of time we spend within a flashback is just right, before moving on to the next one, and the tension that is exhibited in each story is balanced with really nicely handled sprinkles of humor. But before we meet any of these women, the movie kicks off with narration, provided by the unseen, but often talked about Addie Ross, the woman who has apparently absconded with one of the husbands. The voice of Addie Ross is provided by Celeste Holm. Her breathy voice that brings Addie to life does add an ethereal quality to this rather mysterious character, but what she says is the exact opposite. It's a somewhat cynical start to the film, introducing us to the neighborhood in which these characters live, the upper middle-class world that Addie is preparing to disrupt. Keeping Addie Ross off-screen was an excellent choice, because the way she is built up in our minds, there's almost no way that any actress could match it. The husbands all refer to Addie as being extremely beautiful, filled with class, always knowing the right things to say, the perfect clothes to wear. In that way, she reminded me of Laura from the film Laura, another 20th Century Fox production. Every woman is jealous of her, and every man is smitten with her. But for all the glowing words spoken about her, Addie Ross is the villain of the movie, lurking off-screen, possibly preying on any of the characters we get to know in the flashbacks. The first flashbacks we observe are those of Deborah Bishop, as played by Jeanne Crain, and her husband Brad, played by Jeffrey Lynn. Deborah reflects on her first introduction into the society in which she's now comfortably a member. She was just out of the waves, putting us at the end of World War II, and newly married to her husband. She feels out of place, and quite out of her league in this world of fancy clothes and expensive restaurants, and learns that apparently Brad and Addie were quite the pair back in the good old days. This story is the weakest in my opinion. There doesn't appear to be any real issues between her and Brad, and the only danger would be if Brad were so embarrassed by his country hick wife that he decided to run back into the arms of Addie. But we never get any hints of that, which leads to a criticism of the writing for the Brad character. Jeffrey Lynn is fine in the part, but there's something rather generic and bland about the character. You don't really get to know him enough to tell if he is unhappy with his choice of wife or not. Jeanne Crain, on the other hand, is quite good. The hair and makeup department try their best to make her appear unattractive, but they cast Jeanne Crain. I don't think you're going to get many people in the audience going, "She doesn't belong with the glamorous likes of Linda Darnell or Ann Sothern," no matter how frizzy you make her hair or how outdated her dress might be. Her problems are relatable ones. I'm sure everyone has felt like they didn't belong with the group they're with at some point, or felt humiliated by something even though likely no one else even remembers what happened. But it's still a weaker segment than what follows. Next, we meet Rita and George, played by Ann Sothern and Kirk Douglas. Rita is the one that takes Deborah under her wing and reassures her that it doesn't matter what clothes she wears, she and the rest of their friends aren't all that scary. But as Rita's recollections begin, we see her getting dressed for the evening and trying to hurry her husband into getting dressed in his tuxedo because she is desperate to impress her boss, for whom she writes radio soap operas. This reveal shows us that Rita isn't quite as confident as she would have Deborah and others believe, and she depends on physical appearances and people-pleasing just as much as Deborah. The source of Rita and George's problems are even more realistic than the previous couples, and they boil over at a dinner party which, we learn, took place the day before the movie began. Rita mentions right near the beginning that she and George aren't speaking, but it took me a very long time to realize that the flashback is depicting what happened that led to that point. As I said, Rita is trying to impress her boss and the boss's husband, two extremely rude individuals that deign to visit this humble suburb for supper, which must be enjoyed while listening to their all-important programs on the radio and the even more important commercials that divide them. This is an annoying, for the characters, almost sitcom-like obstacle to overcome. But it unearths a whole host of problems that lie beneath the surface of Rita and George's marriage. Rita, as a writer for these programs, makes a great deal more than her schoolteacher husband. These fluffy soap operas are a decided step down from the literary classics that George holds dear. Her career keeps her very busy, well into the night and on weekends, and even busy enough to have completely forgotten that it's her husband's birthday. But you know who didn't forget his birthday and even sent a present? I'll give you a hint. Her name starts with Addie and ends with Ross, and she includes a romantic Shakespeare quote in the package. These scenes are great. Kirk Douglas is wonderful in the role, and it's fun watching him because you know the fuse is lit as soon as the horrid Mrs. Manley shatters his newly acquired Brahms record. And once he's given the opportunity, he tears into her and the whole radio industry in a very entertaining monologue that still works today. The collective lowering of the world's IQ has only worsened, especially compared to 1949. Ann Sothern plays Rita as a woman who simply hasn't realized how her chosen occupation has affected her family. And it works. The conflicts that it has sparked are interesting to watch, and the whole dinner party scenario leaves the audience wondering if it could have resulted in driving George away. It's during these scenes that we meet Thelma Ritter, who quickly and handily steals every scene she appears in. She's playing the family housekeeper who isn't afraid to let the cat out of the bag that her maid uniform and the more extravagant party preparations are not customary for this household. She's always a delight in everything she appears in, with Rear Window being the first thing that comes to mind, even though it's an obvious choice, and I was surprised to realize she's not even credited in this movie. The final couple we spend time with is Laura May and Porter, she seemingly being a young gold digger from the poor side of town who marries the wealthy head of several department stores. Their relationship is by far the most complicated, as we watch the progression of their courtship from what I believe is their first date up until the rather unceremonious proposal, and then compare to how it has crumbled since then. What's so fascinating to watch about their story is the manipulations that Laura May uses to snare Porter, and how he at first falls for them and then rejects them for a time. Linda Darnell as Laura May is so perfect for the role of what would be a femme fatale if we shifted into the realm of film noir. She's playing a woman that is desperate to and succeeds in escaping her lower class upbringing and brings her mother with her. The house in which they live by the end is a huge step up from the one in which we meet them. And speaking of that house, this could be a rather depressing romance to watch, an older man possibly being taken advantage of by a scheming younger woman, or on the flip side, a woman ending up in what could be a loveless marriage just for the sake of money. And we watch this play out in their cramped little house which sits directly beside the railway tracks. And when those trains pass, everything and everyone shakes and rattles until the train is gone. It's a great way of injecting comedy into the situation, and it is very funny, but it is also a literal representation of being on the wrong side of the tracks. And those trains carrying people far away are a constant reminder to Laura May that she too needs to get out of there by any means necessary. Porter Hollingsway is played by Paul Douglas in his first credited screen role. Paul Douglas did not have a very long career, unfortunately passing away in 1959, but in his first movie, he comes in fully formed as the type of character I've seen him play in other films. He's always the loud, kind of brusque older man that tells people off and gets what he wants, whether he's a theater producer in Forever Female or a police captain in Panic in the Streets. But here, there's also such vulnerability and a yearning for a successful marriage that he thinks is doomed from the start. And there's a cynical belief that Laura May never loved him, despite his being head over heels for her, even if he doesn't always admit it. And here again, he makes constant references to Addie Ross, who is built up as competition in Laura May's mind, her framed photograph adorning his piano when she first visits his house. Their floundering marriage is definitely the one that looks to be in the worst shape. Once the flashbacks have ended, we return to the present day as the women nervously return home to see which husband has vanished. I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, since that's the only suspense that the movie can have, so if you have yet to watch it, please feel free to skip to the time code below. But, for everyone else, I really love the ending. We get the happy reconciliation between Rita and George, and her decision to put her family ahead of her career ambitions. But we also see Deborah realize that Brad is not home when she gets there, which he did warn her might happen right from the start, but that pesky letter must have wiped that memory clean. And then we see Laura May go home, and Porter is also missing. But then he shows up and they go right back to taking potshots at one another before all of our characters meet up at the restaurant that they first met at. And the only one missing is Brad. Seeing the friendship between these couples feels really natural, and the sense of shared history between the events of the flashbacks and now informs their comfort around one another. I especially enjoyed seeing Deborah and Porter talking together. She being the farm girl and he being the wealthiest among them, their conversation now happens on the same level. They can be annoyed with one another, try to encourage each other, and you can feel the progression of these characters over the years. Deborah is about to leave for the evening, and then Porter stops her to admit he was the one that was about to run off with Addie Ross, but stopped and came back. Deborah leaves, eager for Brad to get home the next day. Rita and George also step away, and Porter talks with Laura May. Her choosing to look past what nearly happened and make an attempt at strengthening their marriage was really heartwarming and feels like an earned conclusion. And then they get up from the table, and the voice of Addie Ross greets us once again, before a glass tips over and breaks on the table, and we fade to the end credits title card. That ending isn't explained, and I'm glad it isn't. I think it's just meant to represent the influence that Addie Ross has over everyone and everything, but for these three couples, her spell has been broken. And this image just shows us her being defeated. These three women have all envied her for years, but her envy for the lives they have is even stronger. Her plan to cause turmoil amongst what should be three happy marriages has failed, and she accepts the loss. The movie was adapted from a novel entitled A Letter to Five Wives. The initial plans were to change it to 4 wives until they finally settled on just 3. The list of actresses who would have occupied those 4 or 5 roles is quite interesting. At one point, Jean Tierney, Maureen O'Hara, Alice Faye, Dorothy McGuire, and Ann Baxter were all connected to the movie. And the role of Addie Ross could have gone to Joan Crawford or Ida Lupino, although those casting options might have only been considered if Addie was on screen in some draft of the script. Keeping the characters limited to 3 wives was the best choice. Having too many would, I think, clutter up the story and either lengthen the movie to an absurd runtime or truncated the stories for everyone. The movie we got feels much more intimate and allows us to really get a feel for the characters and understand their stories. The movie was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars and took home the Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay Oscars for Joseph Mankiewicz, the same awards he won again a year later for All About Eve. A Letter to Three Wives is a great classic film that I highly recommend. It's got a fantastic script, is filled with wonderful performances, and finds a satisfying ending to a story in which that isn't necessarily a guarantee. If you've never seen it, go check it out. Thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, hope you'll check back for more at Hildebrand Productions. Thanks again, and adios for now.